Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to give everyone a minute or two to get signed in. While we're waiting to get started, I'll do quick introductions and take care of some housekeeping items. So I'm Jessie Bieringer, Head of Marketing for 3D Group, and I'll be facilitating the session today. Joining me to discuss employee feedback is Dr. Dale Rose. Dr. Rose is a nationally recognized expert on talent assessment, coaching, and 360-degree feedback. Dr. Rose personally coaches over 100 leaders per year, including focused post-360 feedback sessions and also more long-term coaching engagements. While he most frequently works at the executive and C-suite level, he's supported leaders at every level from board chair to first-line supervisor. In addition to his coaching and assessment work, Dr. Rose is a widely published author in academic journals, and his book, Hire Better Teachers Now, was recently released by Harvard Education Press. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation using the chat box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll be answering as many of your questions as we can at the end. So thank you all for joining us today for 360s versus alternative forms of feedback. What's the difference and why should we care? Dale, I'll hand it over to you to get started.
Thanks, Jessie, and thank you all for joining me today to hear about what I hope will be a very interesting topic. We're here to talk about 360 feedback and alternate forms of feedback. There have been quite a few new technologies, if you will, that have emerged over the last maybe 3-4 years. Lots of discussion in the popular press about them and things like that. So I thought it would be useful to take a moment and take a look at each of them, or a set of them anyway, and think more clearly and deeply about what is the value and what are the benefits and risks of each. I've actually written a book chapter on this topic as well, so I've got some good background in it. It should be coming out fairly soon in our upcoming Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback. So there are more details to come, I guess, there. So again, thinking about these alternate forms of feedback, these new methodologies, these new technologies. Technology, of course, is a very popular way to make a new process sound interesting and fun. So let's see if we can dive in a little bit to how valuable these tools are and what the kind of pros and cons are each, and how do they stack up with 360s. So first, let's start just thinking about what is feedback and why do we get feedback. We get feedback all the time, right? You're getting feedback now. Your body's getting feedback about where you're sitting or standing or how warm or how cold it is. So as humans, we're pretty well dialed into processing feedback. It turns out that feedback in the workplace is similar in many ways, but different in others. Kind of one of the core tools for feedback, or core goals, if you will, for feedback is it helps us to think about how are we doing on getting to a destination? So the example I like to use, and I've used this actually with a group of pilots at United Airlines. They didn't like it very much, but they were, I think, quibbling on the details. So if we look at the way an airplane flies, what I said at the time was airplanes don't fly straight. I think that was the part they didn't like. But if an airplane is trying to get from point A to point B, as it's flying through the air, it will veer off course slightly, right? So if we look down here at this part of the early curve here, the airplane starts to slightly move off course, and the GPS or whatever it is gives them feedback. Even the compass gives it feedback and says, oh, you got to get back online. And so then the plane kind of course corrects and gets back online, but then it slowly drifts again and more feedback comes in and it redirects. And eventually it gets to, where it needs to go. It's just not a perfectly straight line. And the way it does that is through feedback. Well, the same thing happens in the workplace. You've got a goal of being, showing up on time. You've got a goal of, delegating really effectively. You need to get feedback periodically about how well you're meeting that goal, how well you're lined up with your intentions around what you're trying to accomplish. What we know about people is we aren't always aware of how effective we're being, and we need that feedback. So the premise of feedback in any form is to really keep you getting online toward a destination. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. How well is the feedback we're getting keeping us in line to that destination? Typically, that destination is going to have something to do with change, right? I'm trying to change to be more effective communicator, a more effective delegator, whatever the case may be. But again, finding out, well, how am I doing now, and how are my adjustments working becomes critical. So one question that's worth asking yourself is, how do your employees now figure out what they need to develop? How do they know what they should improve and how they should improve? So again, as I mentioned, we're all getting feedback all the time. What are they doing now? What are those ways that they get feedback? I mean, one of the things you do is you get feedback from your boss. That's kind of the traditional way. If you're out of line, off target, boss is going to tell you. But we know that leadership is complex. There are a lot of behaviors that you need to be monitoring and paying attention to. So what are those methods? Well, I'm going to bucket them into 5 different tools, and we're going to look at each one of those options for the ways employees get feedback. Of course, employees do get feedback in more informal ways, right? They just offhanded comments, that sort of thing. But if you think about what tools they're using to methodically figure out, well, what do I need to do to get better? They're going to need a tool. The water cooler comments aren't really that helpful for development. So those tools are varied, and these are the ones that we're going to go through. We're going to look at each one in terms of the pros and cons, and then do a little contrast at the end. So what each of these has in common is you're getting feedback from your environment, right? The workplace is a social environment, social system, if you will. And so getting feedback from that system from employees, particularly leaders getting feedback from others, right? Leadership is a contact sport. It's one where your ability to influence, motivate, direct others is very much dependent upon the interaction between those individuals. So understanding those interactions in one of these various ways becomes incredibly valuable. So the interesting thing is there's this potential, right, for peer and colleague workplace feedback to be incredibly beneficial. But the question is, what's the quality of that feedback, right? So you can hear lots of different messages from people that come in different shapes and sizes. How do you pay attention to which ones are most useful or not, right? Being told that you're sassy is feedback, but what do you do with it? And where did it come from? And how credible is it? How useful is it for your specific role and what you're doing now? Maybe being sassy is good. Maybe it's just one person that thinks you're being sassy. How well do you weigh that? So getting feedback from colleagues is valuable, but getting quality feedback that can guide you in the direction that you're looking to go is much more important than just getting feedback. And I think we'll see as we look at some of these different methods, some of them are good at getting feedback, but not so good at getting quality feedback. So let's look at our first one, popular by crowd, if you will, the crowdsourced feedback. So crowdsourced feedback kind of borrows on a tool that's been used for a long time, but since the internets have been around, if you will, for fundraising. So it's a great way to, hey, who's interested in, funding pet adoptions in this city or whatever. It's a great way to get a lot of folks who might be willing to pitch in a little bit to get enough funds to do a particular project or support a particular cause. But how good is crowdsourced feedback as a methodology for getting feedback from employees and colleagues? Fundamentally, what these tend to be are sort of online type mobile apps that anybody can say, "Hey, Joe, great presentation," or whatnot. So sort of the entire universe of the company is eligible to give feedback to whomever about whatever. That's kind of the premise of it. Perhaps the best known or most covered in the press, frankly, version of this came out in GE, and it was really, this methodology was maybe 2 or 3 years ago that it came out as a very kind of hip new idea. GE was, again, kind of the one that ended up getting a lot of the press. There were others, but it got probably the most press around it. So it was a mobile app, much as I described, and the idea was that employees could go in and provide what they call praise or pointers. They use the term consider for constructive feedback, and they use the term continue for kudos. So you could provide a consider comment, which was considered a way to give people more constructive, or one might say negative feedback, depending on how you look at it. Interestingly, when they did their first pilot studies and whatnot, and they were getting feedback from their users, what they found was that the term feedback was a little too scary for people. They really preferred insights. They wanted it to feel a little nicer and friendlier. So one of the things that we see with this app and the way it kind of rolled out, and then even as we'll see in a bit, some of the data that came out is this app and this process, this kind of crowdsourced feedback approach, really produced mostly, in fact, almost exclusively positive comments, positive, continues. Very rarely were considers used. And it turned out that in particular, people were pretty much flat out refusing, and I've worked with a number of companies that use these tools, but pretty much flat out refusing to provide any feedback to their managers that was negative in any way. So I've interviewed actually a number of different employees that had, not necessarily here at GE, but at other companies, where they were saying, oh yeah, I would never give any negative feedback about my boss, no chance. Why is that? Well, there's no anonymity. So really what you find here is this, and a lot of this tool grew out of sort of the positive psychology movement of let's give everybody praise about what they're doing, and that will change them in positive ways. But there are some real issues with that. So a couple years ago, there were others that kind of glommed onto this, and it became very popular. Let's just let feedback be, for everyone, by everyone, if you will. But that lack of anonymity really had an impact on the data. Well, there were other companies that did this as well, and a couple years ago, it was so much in the press that you almost had the impression that it was just kind of the new wave. Well, it turned out that it was really only about 6% of companies. Now, some of these were, well-recognized brands and well-known and all that sort of thing. So it created a lot of buzz. But when you look more closely, there really wasn't a lot of folks shifting to this methodology. There were a bunch that were trying it and playing around with it, but the massive shift into crowdsourced feedback didn't happen the way it was kind of being advertised. I think one of the reasons for this is that if you look at some of the comments in the pilot studies that people did, and these are direct comments from employees that were in these firms, it turned out that the value of the data was fairly limited, that the quality of it, hey, great job on that presentation, was not a great way to figure out, well, what do I need to do to improve? Nothing wrong with praise, nothing wrong with knowing that you're doing well, nothing wrong with having that, but from a change perspective, it was maybe only one half of the equation. Now, earlier this year, I actually attended a session at a professional conference, at the SIOP conference, and heard 7 different companies that had piloted these tools present some of their results and experiences. And what we found was really only about half reported one of the big promises of crowdsourced feedback being that it would increase the quality of the interactions with managers, so they would have less formal conversations and more frequent informal conversations. Pepsi found that really only about half reported that level of use. It's a whole lot of people using it for only half of them to get the benefit. And at J&J, they found that even fewer folks used the tool at all, that it was a sort of a subset of the population. Interestingly, it was not. They found that particular group was not defined by, the younger generation or any of that. It was actually a pretty good cross-section across the organization. But it was really only about a quarter of the population. And interestingly, after a couple of months, the popularity even waned further. So it became kind of this, oh, that's kind of fun, and then, yeah, well, I'm not getting much out of it. Feedback's not that useful. It's just another thing. So what we found is that it sort of sounded good, it was easy, it was convenient, but there wasn't a lot of impact going on. The quality of the data, again, just not as good as what people would like to create that kind of change. So, there's some risks associated there. It's certainly convenient, but the data just is not strong. And if you're trying to improve leaders, this is not going to be a way to get your leaders to improve for a couple reasons. A, they may not be using the tool at all. B, the data themselves aren't going to be very good. And when they do get data, it's almost all going to be positive. again, nothing wrong with positive feedback, but if you're really trying to develop yourself and grow, you probably want a balanced view that considers other things that you can do and change. So the bottom line, and one of these employees put it just perfectly, it's a convenient, sort of scalable tool, no doubt. It is a way to get feedback, but perhaps not, and for a small part of the population, but perhaps not leaning on it as a primary method to help leaders guide and develop their growth as leaders. So that's crowdsourced feedback. Now, similar kind of vein to crowdsourced feedback in terms of a new methodology that emerged. There was a period right around the same time that crowdsourced feedback was becoming really popular in the press. This notion of ratingless reviews emerged, and maybe we can, the premise was maybe we can get people to not do numeric ratings, because if they get a 4.3, what does that mean anyway? And so, boy, these ratings, these numeric ratings just aren't that useful, and everybody uses a different scale anyway. And so maybe we should just do ratingless reviews, because it'll force managers into a more thoughtful posture, whereby they're actually just writing out a review. It's not reviewless reviews, it's ratingless reviews. The idea is, instead of asking managers to put numbers on things, we're going to ask them to write out their view of what this person's doing well, what they can improve, that kind of thing. Now, the positive thing here is that you're getting more of a balanced view. It's often pushing both positive and constructive feedback. The challenge is, of course, that it's solely dependent upon the managers providing the ratings. The other premise, again, is that they could keep the data over long periods of time. So over the course of the year, they could go in and kind of type in their notes and whatnot, and then at the end of the year or mid-year or wherever they're doing their actual review, they could go back and reference those. But again, all written feedback, no numbers. So compelling in some respects. Certainly you talk to almost any manager and they will tell you that doing reviews is their least favorite part of their day. And certainly we hear lots of controversy about what rating scales are best or worst. So you can see where, again, the popularity comes in. So it turns out, though, when we look at the data around ratingless reviews, and we've looked at this, actually, stat comes from a study that we did here at 3D Group, where we looked back at about 1,000 ratings, qualitative ratings, to kind of look at the quality of those ratings. And when you read through 1,000 ratings of individuals, you can see pretty quickly that there are not that many comments that are real useful for development. What tends to happen is people may provide a problem. They may say communication needs to be improved. So you kind of have an idea of where that is, but they're not giving you any clarity around what the solution is. Is this listening, or is this speaking clearly? Is it writing? Is it, not a lot of clarity there. So about a quarter of the comments really were valuable and rich, and comments I think can be very useful. So those ratingless reviews can be, I think, very powerful. The trick is that not all of them are, right? So when you start looking at the actual data, for example, you find that they can be a little generic. They can be very difficult from an actionability standpoint. I know something's not right here, but I don't really know what I should do differently, right? Communication skills are a real problem. Okay, well, what about that? You tend to go on and on. Okay, so I just shouldn't talk as much, or is this long emails, et cetera? So the person here is clearly exasperated, but where do I specifically go? It can be very tricky. Generic is a problem. The other problem is it's dependent upon certain things, and we see this type of thing a lot. How much are you going to put weight in somebody telling you to improve your communication who is suggesting that it comes to, complex things and questions? So misspellings, poorly worded sentences, general comments that aren't really specific. There are a lot of challenges when you actually look into the data and the data quality. So that can be a real concern in looking at these. The other interesting thing, if you compare doing ratings numerically to doing comments, we did a study recently where we asked raters to time themselves. And so we looked at how long did it take to do numeric ratings versus open-ended comments. And clearly the numeric ratings were much, much faster. So, a 50-item survey, which these days is maybe a little on the high side, in terms of length, might take you 5 minutes, but it's going to take you 8 minutes to fill out a comment. So it's going to take, you're going to get feedback on 50 items grouped into meaningful competencies versus one comment. Now, of course, people have discretion. They can take less time, but if they're taking less time to write out their comments, they're not going to have as much detail. It's not going to be as thoughtful, et cetera. So there's some real issues with the time to complete and the data quality. The other factor is, what do you do with it? So if you've got a bunch of data from Ratingless reviews, how do you compare leaders? You're looking to promote 1 or 2 or 3 or 20. How do you decide which ones are really better? Which ones do deserve the new assignment or the new raise, the new promotion, et cetera? Of course, you wouldn't want to let the numerics drive everything, but numerics do a nice job of differentiating and not leaving you subject to your own bias around how you interpret that Ratingless review. So it becomes much more difficult to make those talent decisions when you don't have the ability to look at the individual numbers and use that as a way to differentiate individuals. Also, from an individual development standpoint, you have to decide which of these comments are you going to weigh more strongly than others, and that isn't necessarily all that easy. When you've got numeric ratings, it's going to give you more of an idea of, okay, this behavior is better than that behavior, and so I need to leverage it more, and maybe this other one I need to bring up. It lets you differentiate between individual behaviors much more clearly than the Ratingless reviews do. So usability can be an issue. Again, if you happen to get a lot of really good, thoughtful, well-written comments, there's some richness to it, but differentiation can be difficult. So again, that yes and might be the answer. A couple other interesting things to consider around the risks. So imagine all the managers in your organization. You might have, 10,000 managers. You might have 10. But just picture them in your mind. Here they all are. We know as people vary widely. Some are great, some struggle, some spend a lot of time in your office asking you how they can be better or bringing problems to you. But how are they at writing comments? How skilled are they at really writing nuanced, well-written feedback that an employee can take on a balanced way and use to develop and grow? My guess is they're not all great. How good are they on legal issues? Are they aware of the things that might get them in a little trouble if they say it this way or say it that way or focus on one issue or another? When you start really thinking through that pool, you might find, oh yeah, she's not maybe so good. I'm not so sure I want her writing out in length her opinion, her views, where will her biases come in? What about this guy? He seems problematic. Or how about this guy over here? The point is, it only takes a few, and getting the entire group to be really skilled at providing great feedback, not an easy task. The structure and standardization that you get in numeric ratings actually can cut through a lot of that. You can do some rater training on that rating scale. You're structuring the areas that they're rating, et cetera. So there can be some real risks that you've got to be thoughtful of in ratingless reviews. The bottom line is, when I look at it, I think ratingless reviews are frankly kind of an excuse to try to get out of and change something that hasn't worked particularly well in the performance management space, and to say, well, let's just get rid of this part people don't like. But there hasn't been a lot of thought into, okay, what's the impact on quality of what we're actually getting when we've removed the quote bad part or part of the bad part, but we've brought in some other challenges and risk. And at the end of the day, it's not going to be very helpful for many of the uses that you want these kind of data for, particularly in terms of differentiating individuals. The stakeholder interviews is perhaps another way that you can think about getting feedback. So we call them stakeholder interviews because from our point of view, they really aren't 360 interviews. We do these interviews accompanied by a 360 interview very frequently, particularly regarding sort of executive assessment or CEO evaluation. Those kind of things will often include an interview. but thinking about them more as stakeholder interviews rather than, quote, 360 interviews, I think adds some clarity around what they do. So and these are pretty simple. The basic premise here is that you're interviewing a third party, typically, usually from outside the organization. If you're inside the organization, the nuances, the politics, that can be very, very thick. These are very rarely done by internal resources, not universally, but typically a third-party interviewer will interview a host of stakeholders around a particular leader or individual to find out where their strengths and development areas are. Often there'll be competency-driven questions, so there'll be some structure behind it. In a sort of a typical interview, they're focused on what are those growth areas, so there is an opportunity there to not just get the positive feedback that we're getting with crowdsourced feedback, but really push it a little bit. There is an opportunity for that interviewer to do some follow-up, to integrate it with some career history, and then the reporting will look a little bit more balanced. So again, the interviewer has an opportunity to look at all the data in whole and then package it in a way that provides a clear and clean story about what the data holistically are saying. Again, rather than emphasizing, one of the challenges with ratingless reviews, for example, or even the crowdsourced feedback, is you end up with sort of oddball comments. We've seen comments, things like, oh yeah, he needs a new pair of shoes, or why does he have such a nice car, and things like this that really can distract the person receiving feedback and start getting them focused on things they shouldn't from a development standpoint. So you can, as an interviewer, you can shape the content to be really valuable from a guiding the development perspective. So this is kind of your typical process. There's also a much more rigorous approach where interviews can actually be recorded. They can be transcribed. I'm pretty sure no one's using a tape deck like this these days. Those phones are pretty handy. But you can transcribe them. You can identify them for theme. There are a lot of highly rigorous qualitative research methods that can be used in an interview process that can level up the game quite a bit in terms of the quality of the data that you get. Again, in this case, you're not quantifying. So in typical interviews, you might say, 60% of the raters said that you needed to delegate better, that kind of thing, which is sort of a pseudo-qualitative method. So in a really highly rigorous interview, you might not do that. You might really use some more nuanced techniques. This can provide a much more rigorous, kind of reliable and valid data set. Of course, the challenge here is it's going to be a lot more time-consuming, a lot more costly, and that's really true of both of these methods. Again, though, the quality of the data can be high, so there's some real value there. Some of the risks, however, associated with stakeholder interviews, and this is one that's often overlooked, particularly when people are thinking about them as 360 interviews. But there's no anonymity, right? So when a rater is filling out a survey or an online tool that masks their identity, they may have a little bit more freedom to be honest. Even with an interviewer, the interviewer knows who it is that said what. So that veil of anonymity that exists in other methods does not show up in the rater interviews and stakeholder interviews. And so indeed, one wonders, well, how does the fact that they are face-to-face with another individual who may or may not share this information or have an opinion, how does social desirability come into the conversation and affect the data? Very difficult to get standardized questions. You can do sort of some guidelines by competency, cover this topic, cover that topic, answer some core questions. But the basic methodology of an interview is to follow the thread, right? Follow your nose, find out more, continue down the path. The ability to follow up is the strength of an interview, but where you follow up with one person, you may not follow up with others. When you look at interviews across lots and lots of individuals, perhaps that particular interview tends to ask more probing, harder follow-up questions of women compared to men. So there can be some real challenges there in terms of the way the data are collected and internal biases that might show up. If you are quantifying responses, you lose a lot of variance. What percentage said you need to delegate better is not nearly as valuable as, well, what exactly about delegating? So the quantifying approach can be an issue. So anyway, some definite risks with interviews. I think they can be very useful when augmented with other tools, but knowing ahead of time that there are some challenges can be helpful in terms of the way you kind of put the data in context a little bit. So the bottom line is they can be very useful, but scalability is a real challenge. Almost universally, these methods are going to be used at an executive population level just because of the cost and effort required. And they usually are going to be used in a way that's augmented with other tools. Although I will say that I know of a Fortune 25 company that uses these exclusively and uses them for very few people and uses them to promote individuals. And so it isn't that it's not. It isn't that it's universally used only at that executive level, but it is rare, I would say, to use these tools due to the cost. All right, one of my personal favorites, well, favorites perhaps in quotes. There's a lot of methodologies out there where when you look, they're calling a tool a 360 something or other, and they're sort of borrowing the term 360 to say this is a 360 feedback process or tool. But when you look under the covers, you realize, oh, wait a minute, this is not really exactly 360. So what I'm calling these are kind of the Quasi 360 methods that are out there. There are a number of them. I'm going to illustrate sort of one in particular. I guess I would say personal brand surveys are kind of one aspect of these, but there are dozens of different tools out there sort of masquerading as 360s, and when you look a little deeper, it calls into question a bit. So, but let me dig into the personal brand surveys as an example. This is actually the kind of text off of a particular tool's site that I'll be showing you a particular tool. I'm not going to name the tool, but I am going to show kind of how they're being positioned by the provider. So this idea that we can get the real story of what your brand inside the organization is using a tool like this. The interesting trick is, what is that brand and what does that mean and what do you do about it? And we'll look at a little further into what those look like. So here's an example of what a personal brand survey might ask, and this is one that I actually was presented by a colleague who wanted me to complete it about him. So the question here was, and this is literally a question, if Dale was a dog, what kind of dog would he be? They didn't provide the picture here, actually. You had to use your own imagination and write in what you thought that dog would be. So hopefully you can see that there are, and this question would be asked of 10 or 15 coworkers that you could then, and then your feedback report would tell you, well, gee, your coworker said you could be a German Shepherd or a poodle or literally the feedback that you're getting. They put in the survey, they must obviously get noise about this, they actually put in the survey the notion that they might be frivolous questions, but they actually could provide the most valuable feedback in the survey. Very challenging for me to imagine how that could be, but I'm not kidding. This is a commercially available instrument available on the market today. Another sort of depth into, it's not all just open-ended this way. They also provide some quantitative checkboxes. So of these 92 attributes, I'll give you a closer look at it in a second, we will be asked to pick 10 of them that best describe the individual. So you've got to read through all 92 of these and pick the 10 that most reflect the person's brand. Now, if you look real closely at some of these, let's just say that the feedback that you get here could be interpreted in a number of different ways. Is being Zen-like a good thing or a bad thing, and what does it really mean? And I think more to the point, if everybody says that you're Zen-like, does that just mean you need to be more energetic because you're a salesperson, or what? Like, what do these things mean, and what does it mean when they're all mixed around, and you get various different folks saying that you are worldly, political, Zen-like, savvy. So lots of different pictures that one might bring up. Very little reliability in terms of rate of reliability on these on these types of items. Then, once you've done all of this and selected your 10, then you're actually asked to rank the 10, 1 through 10, which if you've ever done any sort of ranking exercise, particularly with 10 items, one thing to rank 3 items. Ranking 10 takes a long time. So the time it takes is quite exceptional. Another section, just again to give you kind of the flavor of it, is asking you what sort of a role this person might be. This is a self-survey, but it would be, what role would Dale be, and you would be rating me, for example. So, are you most likely to be successful as an administrator, a caregiver, a creator, a doer, a facilitator? And they define what each one of these are, seemingly to be clear. But I think one of these makes the point most clearly. Do I not check the doer box because I just don't, take a portion of the work and execute on it? Do I just want to, I'm just a caregiver. I don't do anything. I just take care of other people. If you look at these, it's not as though these roles are mutually exclusive. People do all of these roles all of the time. So bottom line, a lot of legal risks here. Big challenge. If you're making decisions on the basis of how people feel about what kind of dog somebody is, you've got some serious legal exposure there. The actionability, very challenging, and really the potential to demoralize employees as they're trying to interpret the data seems extraordinary to me. So again, I wanted to give you a flavor for it. It's hard to kind of believe and describe in some ways, but lots of different tools like this are out there that are available that may seem good and be easily sold to a particular population, but again, the quality of data, the actionability, not super strong. All right, let's look at our last tool here, 360 Feedback, sort of see how it stacks up a little bit. So when you look at 360 Feedback, it's of course an opportunity to get feedback from multiple different groups, right? Your peers, your direct reports, other groups. And we know that you end up with lots of different perspectives. And I think one of the things 360 attempts to do, perhaps more than other tools, is to parse and separate and evaluate each of those different perspectives, so that you're not having, this grumpy guy down here at the bottom with some big long overblown comment overweighing the results. That you're able in some ways to balance out his perspective in this other group from the other 3. And so perhaps more balanced approach. 360s, of course, are more systemic. They're typically longer surveys, behavioral, very specific. They're done more on a periodic basis, and they typically include a process of looking at your feedback, thinking about it, deciding where to act, constructing a development plan, likely with a coach or other feedback provider, a facilitator, and then working with your manager around, here's what I'm hearing, here's what I want to work on, resourcing that development effort. So it's a much different process in terms of being indeed more lengthy, but perhaps more thoughtful, more careful, and there's great potential for it to be more strategically aligned. When we try to define 360 feedback, and some colleagues of mine and I did this recently in an article we wrote, because we felt like it was important to distinguish 360 from others, we recognize that one of the key elements of 360 feedback is it's a very careful process designed to allow individuals to get data that they can use to create change. And that change can be individual, it can be organizational. Couple of key features. The notion is you're gathering data to understand what other people's perceptions are. It's behavioral. And importantly, you're specifying behaviors that are valued by the organization that are going to be linked to that organization's strategy. Being a golden retriever is not linked to anybody's strategy. Having open-ended comments that are all about how great you are or what you did well doesn't help drive the strategy. The key, too, though, is the ability to make meaningful comparisons between groups. So you want data that you can say, well, gee, my peers see me this way, my direct reports see me differently, and I can evaluate and understand those differences and tailor my development where it's appropriate. So if I'm perhaps communicating extremely well with my direct reports, but my peers think that I'm not communicating well, that's going to help me, sort of right size or dial my development in a very, very clear way. So what does it look like? Well, here's an example, kind of a typical example, and a lot of different ways to format it, where you're going to get feedback at a competency level the top piece is the aggregate of all the items down below, broken out by rater group. And then you're going to get really specific behaviors. So the first behavior here, listens to others attentively. This is very clear, very specific, and you can easily parse how you did from the perspective of other rater groups. You can look at expresses ideas clearly and concisely, and compare that one. So when you really look at it, what 360 Feedback is doing is it's giving you the standard set of behaviors that each rater rates, and allows you to compare the different rating groups. It also gives you a sense. You can see these up arrows and down arrows of the overall quality of those ratings. These are based on some normative data compared to others. So it's going to direct and focus development in a much sort of different way than some of these other methods. When we think about the impact, it's important to recognize this link to strategy, right? So we've got a project that we're in the middle of now where we're working with a CEO who's trying to shift the strategy and culture of his organization, and we're working with him to define, well, what are the behaviors your leaders need to exhibit to achieve that strategy? If you can list out those behaviors, make them clear and focused and actionable, and then have all your leaders read those behaviors, rate themselves, understand how others see them on those behaviors, and then start developing in that direction, that is a huge force for pushing that change that CEO is trying to achieve across the organization. And she can drive it all the way down through the organization at all levels. So really potent way of communicating and driving change that aligns with the strategy. When you're really careful about the way you collect the data and you're methodical about making sure it's anonymous, making sure that it's presented in a way that protects that anonymity, et cetera, highly credible data. People look at the data and they realize, okay, this is their point of view. There isn't a lot of questioning, and you find you get plenty of constructive feedback along with the more positive feedback. Importantly, it's also not feedback that comes at you every day. It's feedback that you take, put together, come together with a plan to move forward. Feedback every day is very difficult. We all have jobs, it turns out. We all have things we need to do. We need to act and be getting things done. Trying to develop at the same time that you're doing things isn't always going to work. So you need opportunities to sort of structure on a periodic basis your development and move it forward, rather than being consistently kind of nibbled at with lots and lots of feedback that keeps you being distracted, et cetera. So I think the time to reflect is important. And then the other piece is that the way it's structured in its best case, and some of our benchmark studies are starting to show that this is increasing, is that the manager and or HR are actively involved in helping those leaders develop and change. So there's some accountability. It's really critical. So indeed, 360 Feedback does provide a very actionable and safe way to get feedback that is quite scalable. It's infrequent, right? It's not all the time. And I think with Facebook, the Facebook world of wanting to perhaps see this stuff all the time, maybe that there's a desire for more frequent feedback. 360 is not going to provide that, but it is going to give you something that's going to help leaders create lasting change, not sort of reactive, periodic, go left, go right, go left, go right sort of change. So when we put it all together and kind of compare these all, I think what we see is that the bottom line across the board is that these other methodologies that are being used are either really convenient and quick and highly scalable, but producing questionable data of questionable use. Or, for example, in the case of stakeholder interviews, they can produce really reliable, rich, valuable data, but not super scalable, not very cost effective. I think 360 Feedback kind of finds the happy medium between those two, and if you design the process well, it can actually achieve lasting change where some of these others may not get those goals. And we've talked about this in some of our writings, that at the end of the day, feedback is about change. You're trying to help people understand how they need to change to get to the destination they're at. So you have to be thoughtful about, well, how is this feedback method going to get them there? And not just, is it going to be user-friendly and easy to do? That's not unimportant, but it can't be the end-all, be-all, because easy to use is not necessarily going to drive change and actual change. when we've looked at what it takes to create change, we realize there really are kind of 4 key components. Well, 3 components and then one that's an accelerator. So we've talked about accountability. Well, really, I actually like to start with relevant content. So the content has to mean something. It has to be valuable to me in my role, valuable to me in my context. In this organization, strategically, this is what I need to be doing. Then the data I get on those relevant behaviors needs to be credible. I need to believe that people are trying to give me feedback to help improve, not trying to give me feedback to, feel better, or because they didn't want to, tell me the truth, or whatever the case may be. So the data have to be credible, and that's where that anonymity piece comes in. And then there needs to be some accountability and follow-up. So, okay, great, I need to do this better. I believe the data is right, but no one's paying attention. I got to get things done. If you don't have that accountability, people are likely not going to change. They're not going to focus on the areas that are most critical. Census participation just has to do with, if you want organizational change, you really ought to drive it all the way through the organization and not just have the few getting the feedback. So these are the components that you need to look for, and I think, frankly, evaluate any feedback methodology on how relevant will the content be, how credible will the data be, how are we going to hold people accountable for using the data. If you don't do those, you're not going to get change. It might be a fun app, but it's not going to get you the results you're looking for. And then if you want those results to be strategically relevant and move the organization broadly, you got to get everyone to participate. So there's a set of things here that I think 360 stands much higher than the others in terms of producing each of these. Some of the safeguards, the normative aspects. The standardized content is just critical for being able to understand where is this feedback coming from, where do I need to focus my efforts. So when I look at it at the end of the day, I feel that some of these methods are perhaps more fad than quality, and the data that you get are not necessarily going to get you what you want from a change standpoint. There is that trade-off of convenience versus care and thought and methodical efforts at development. But I would argue that I think if you're looking to change leaders and help them improve, you really want to be focused on a little bit more high quality process. And again, you got to factor in that scalability and cost. And I think when you look at it, 360 feedback stacks up pretty well against the others. So that's what I've got. Let's turn it over now for questions, if there are any. Jesse.
Yes, we do have a couple of great questions. Mary Ann asked if you have any thoughts about 360s for those with no direct reports, and also 180s with peer and supervisor inputs.
Yeah, absolutely. So individual contributor 360s, particularly in like tech companies, there are a lot of high-end professionals, financial services as well, where they're highly valued, high potential employees, but do not have direct reports. And I think you can, typically you want to construct your survey content to reflect that. So we often will have organizations we'll work with where the individual contributor survey is quite different than the leader survey. It just omits a lot of the things that are around managing others. And so I think individual contributor surveys can be great. Upward feedback, or 180s, interesting the way it was listed. You talked about sort of only from direct reports and your boss. That might be more, a 270 or something, because you always want to include the self in there as well. But yeah, there's no, you don't need to include all different rater groups. You can include customers and your skip level boss and your direct reports and your peers and your, it goes on and on. So I think, right sizing that list of rater groups is perfectly reasonable. We had a great project we did last year with a company that was purely upward feedback. It was very focused on engagement behaviors. There were only 10 of them, I think, that we found to really drive employee engagement, and it was really just direct reports and the individual, and it was really a powerful project.
Okay, thanks. So our next question is from Kristen, who said that they created 360s in-house, and she's looking for some best practices.
Yeah, so in-house 360 is interesting. It runs some risks. So, I think one of the key things is, again, you've got to think about data quality, how well, is it trusted internally? What we've seen, we've run into a number of organizations that do their 360s internally and end up coming to us for kind of two core reasons. A, they felt like the trust in the process was limited because HR and IT can absolutely figure out who said what. So they realized that their actual ratings, my rating of so-and-so, is visible to an internal HR person, an IT person. And when you work with an outside firm, it's actually contracted that they won't share that information to protect the anonymity. So I think that's one risk that you really want to try to mitigate wherever you can. It's a little tricky because if you do encryption and things like that where it's completely anonymous and then you get feedback, we've over the 20 plus years, we've had maybe 3 times where we've received feedback that was really required us to reach out to the client and talk about, there were things around harassment and things like that where we had to kind of break through that veil, and so there are issues that come up, and if internally you've encrypted the data, you can't quite get at the data even if you need to kind of break through that. So that's a little bit of a concern. I would try to mitigate that where you can. The other reason that we see people coming to us are around the effort it does. Just recognizing that running the system, running the software, is something that they could have they could outsource quite easily, and they could have their internal people run it well themselves and or do other things, because while they could run it well themselves, their time could be better spent elsewhere. I think internally the other big one would be around feedback. So what we find is about 65% of companies will provide some sort of facilitator to work with the person around their feedback and help them craft their development guide. And I think that can be very tricky internally. So even if you're a well-trusted internal HR person, you kind of know the players. And if that person is sitting there saying, wow, I can't really work with my boss, he's such a jerk, and what do I do? And, it's very hard for that HR person to forget what they heard in that conversation. And then when all of a sudden that person's boss is up for promotion, those perceptions kind of color their view of that, which might not be the right way to get those data. So, even if you're running the process internally, I would have externals provide that feedback debrief. You can have an accountability mechanism where some of the results or kind of the conclusion of that conversation filters through to the manager and the HR person, but the data themselves and the conversation stays with an outside person. So I guess those are the things that come to mind up front, and I'd be happy to talk to, was it Kristen, more if that would be helpful. But yeah, those are the things that come to mind.
Okay, so we have one more question. There's still time if someone wants to write another one in. The new app seems super convenient, and our employees like being able to use them at any time. Isn't giving instant feedback better than 360s, which are usually annual?
Right. I heard someone once say, use the phrase, feedback's best served warm, which I thought was kind of funny. But I guess, yeah. So I would just disagree. I definitely agree with the convenience and the idea that it's quick and easy. As I pointed out, I think it takes 5 minutes to fill out a full survey. It takes more time to write a comment and be thoughtful about it. What I guess I would say is that getting employees lots of feedback on a like a year basis, like I don't know, 50 days out of 365 or 200 work days, whatever, 50 days I got feedback. I don't think that is of questionable quality. I don't think is as valuable as getting more thoughtful, thorough, periodic feedback. In fact, I think getting lots of feedback like that can be distracting and problematic. So while it's convenient, that convenience actually can be a downside from an impact standpoint. I feel like you're really encouraging people to look at feedback that we know is not valuable, and it can be distracting and potentially even destructive and at worst, but certainly isn't it might even be leading them to the false impression that everything's going great because they're never hearing any negative news. And sure, encouraging and motivating, that's great. Inspiring, I mean, for that tool, I think what I would recommend if I was looking at a crowdsourced feedback tools, I would recommend using it as a way to I would describe it not as a way to develop, but rather a way to give kudos to people. Say, hey, I would just eliminate the possibility of negative feedback. We know it's not happening. So use that in another way and say, hey, if you want to, give an attaboy to people, then do it. Here's a way. And that's actually where most of that software kind of came from, was this idea of motivating employees or encouraging them. And I think that's the way to apply it, is don't make it don't pretend that it's a tool for constructive feedback for development. Make it a tool for congratulating people and telling them what you think they're doing great. Nothing wrong with that, but pretending that it's doing the other thing, I don't think you're getting the value that you were promised.
Okay, so that's all we have time for today, but thank you all for your thoughtful questions. If you have individual questions that we didn't address here during the webinar, please feel free to reach out to us at 510-463-0333 and check out our website at 3dgroup.net. Thank you again and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.